So thanks everyone for joining us. I am Carrie Alexander Lahowski. I'm the Executive Director of the North Coast Athletic Conference. I am the past president of NADIIIAA, and I am a member of our Division III Commissioners Association Officiating Committee. So I'm kind of on behalf of everyone welcoming you and thanking you for taking time out of your day to join us and hear about this officiating project that the Division III commissioners have been working on for quite some time now. This week, we are hosting 6 regional sessions just like this to talk about the report. During 2018-19, as a Commissioners Association, we formed a working group and we connected with the Pictor group to conduct research on officiating. We all kind of know what we think about it, but we thought, hey, we really need to find out what is actually going on. And this is our opportunity to kind of drill down on that data for each specific region of the country, because there are differences a little bit. So as we get started, I want to introduce the members of the Pictor group and our committee that are here today. So we have Carolyn Schliefemovich, if you could just give a little wave as we go through. Sandy Hatfield Club, Mary Struckoff, and Dee Abrahamson. And then from our committee, we have Patrick Summers from the NUMAC, who serves as our chair. We have Dan McCain from the MIAC. And I'm looking to see if anyone else is on. I think right now that is all of us who are here. So just a couple bits of just kind of Zoom etiquette, although we're all experts at this point. If you could keep yourself mute while the presentation is going on, we will be monitoring the chat, or you can raise your hand if you have questions, and then we will have time for questions at the end. But please feel free to use the chat and we can work through there. So I am going to turn this over to Carolyn, but right before I do, if you could mark your calendars for December 15th from 1 to 2 Eastern. So I'm gonna get this wrong, but I think that means 12 to 1 Central. We will be doing a follow-up session to this that will talk about our strategic plan a little bit more in depth and kind of the next steps of this project. So Carolyn, if you would take it away.
Thank you, Carrie. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for spending time with us this afternoon. If this is on your lunch hour, we encourage you to go ahead and enjoy your lunch, but we hope to be presenting some exciting, some very interesting information about the Midwest region, and particularly information that we gathered from our data analysis and collection last academic year. As Carrie indicated, we've been working at this for some time, but on behalf of the Pictor group, it's been our privilege to work on this project with the Division III Commissioners Association. We started last August and have finished the first phase of the report, which was the data collection and analysis, and presented our report at the end of August of this year. So we are now getting ready and actually fully engaged in the strategic planning process. But today what we'd like to do is focus on what we've learned from the data analysis about the Midwest region and share that information with you, and then make sure we allow plenty of time for questions and answers and some insights that will help guide us going forward. So you've met the Pictor group team, but what you see up there on the screen is the Division III Officiating Steering Committee that consisted of 10 commissioners from across the country representing their region, but also a wide variety of sports. Of this group, 5 of these individuals also served on an NCAA Officiating Steering Committee that included commissioners from across all 3 divisions. Because once we got into our work with Division III, the NCAA came to us and asked us if we could expand our data collection work and analysis to include Divisions 2 and 1. And so at that point, we felt it important to create a second steering committee that was cross-divisional. So we started the project with 13 sports at the direction of the commissioners, and that was expanded to 15 sports when the NCAA came on board with us on this project. You see those sports listed there, And so I think the message here is that it was quite a comprehensive study and analysis of officiating, not only across regions, but across all sports, or at least these 15 sports listed here. Next slide, please. And so through our process, we felt it extremely important that we heard from a wide variety of stakeholders. And if you look at the total down there, throughout the course of the year, in either surveys, questionnaires, focus groups, individual interviews, or individual conversations, we connected with over 15,000 individuals. And again, this was across all 3 divisions. But our focus today is going to be on the work that we did and what the findings showed us for Division III, and particularly for the Midwest region. And so you see, not only were commissioners involved, coordinators and assigners from the conferences, but also a very large number of officials. And later in the project, we decided that it was going to be important to hear from the head coaches. So we talked or surveyed over 4,000 head coaches across all 3 divisions, because they play a critical role, as we'll see here in a little bit, in understanding or in driving the culture around officiating. So before I turn it over to Sandy, just want to remind you again to use the chat function, raise your hand, and know that we will have a question and answer at the end, and then we'll take it from there. But Sandy, I'll turn it over to you to begin sharing some of the results and findings.
Thank you, Carolyn, and good afternoon to everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We are going to dive right into the critical issues facing collegiate officiating. And it'll be no surprise to all of you that all stakeholders agreed that there were 2 major issues that were facing collegiate officiating. Certainly the pipeline of officials, and secondly, the availability of quality officials. So I'd like to show you now what the data we learned. This is in regard to all 3, excuse me, this is all of Division III right now. The data that I'm sharing is relative to all of Division III. We're going to drive down on Midwest data in just a moment. We learned that 79% of Division III officials begin their officiating in the high school and youth level. So with that idea in mind, we needed to know what's happening at the high school and youth level. We learned from Officially Human's 2020 data that over 50% are over the age of 50, and 45% are within 6 years of retirement. We also learned from the 2017 NASO data that the current average age of the 15 sports at the youth level is 53 years old. Oops. So we asked, how long does it take from entering into the pipeline of officiating to entering the NCAA? And on average across all sports, for officials that are in the Division III, that are officiating in Division III is 8 years. The average age of all NCAA Division III officials, we learned, is just under the age of 49. And lastly, we learned that 80% of all Division III officials identify themselves as Caucasian or white, and also 85% as male. So what about the availability of officials? We learned that there are 12 sports when coordinators were asked across all sports, when coordinators were asked to identify if there was a time in the last season that they had to reschedule a contest because of a lack of availability of officials. There were actually 12 different sports that had to move a contest at least once during the last full season. There were 3 sports across all 3 NCAA divisions that had to move a contest at least once in the last full season. And those 3 sports were women's lacrosse, men's and women's tennis, men's and women's swimming and diving. And we're going to drill down on the regional data in just a moment. So we went then and asked the officials, what do you see as the most critical issues facing officiating today? And in this particular order, the officials had an opportunity to choose from about 12 different issues. And these are the 4 far and away from the others that they could have chosen from. And this was true actually across all 3 divisions. This particular data is specific to the over 6,800 officials that identified themselves as officiating in Division 3. So the fees are not keeping pace with demands of the job, assigning strongholds or creating advancement barriers, poor sportsmanship in the treatment of officials, as well as recruiting new officials into officiating were the 4 critical issues facing officials. Now I'd like to share with you how we have set up the regions for the purpose of the research. These regions do not specifically follow Division 3, but you can see that it very closely follows the Division 3 regions. Officials were asked to identify a single region. Unlike the divisions, they could identify more than one division if they were officiating across divisions 1 and 2 or 1, 2, and 3. They could answer questions for all of those questions, were identified in that way in those questions. However, for the regions, they were asked to select which region do you receive the majority of your assignments, and they selected a single region. So the Midwest region, 11% of the 6,800 officials identified themselves as receiving the majority of their assignments in the Midwest region in those states identified. So let's dive deep now into the Midwest data. So this question that we asked coordinators in the most recent season, was it necessary for institutional personnel to change a contest? And there were 7 of the 12 sports that were identified across the nation. 7 of those sports in the Midwest were identified by the 41 coordinators that answered the survey. So that's field hockey, women's gymnastics, women's lacrosse, men's and women's soccer, softball, men's and women's tennis, and women's volleyball. The blue square on the right side of your slide there are the 12 sports that were identified across the nation. The 3 in red are the 3 that are across all 3 divisions. Now this slide will show you the age of officials by gender. So it's important to know that these percentages are specific to that gender. What that means is, for example, the largest percentage of male officials identified themselves in the 45 to 54 age group, and the largest category for female officials identified themselves at 24% in the 35 to 44 age group, as well as the 25 to 34 age group. So that bears pretty well for the Midwest in terms of women being a bit younger. The mean age or average age for all NCAA officials, to remind you, was 49. This next slide will share with you officials' race, again, by gender. So I'd like to draw your attention to the bottom of the slide, where it identifies 87% male and 13% female. That is identifying that that's the percentage of officials that identified themselves in those gender categories. So in the Midwest specifically, 88% of male officials identified themselves as Caucasian or white, and 82% of female officials identified themselves as Caucasian or white. The orange box in the top left-hand corner identifies that there was nearly, so just under 80% of Division III officials were Caucasian or white. So we can see in the Midwest, higher percentages, both male and female, find themselves in that, identified themselves in that category. Additionally, 85% of all Division III officials identified themselves as male, just slightly higher in the Midwest region with 87%. With that, I'm going to turn this over to my colleague, Mary Struckoff.
Thanks, Sandy. The next couple of slides I'm going to go over involve retention and recruiting of officials. This first slide is all of Division III officials in the Midwest and their entry point into the avocation of officiating. So you can see, as Sandy mentioned earlier, 79% of all Division III officials begin at the high school or youth levels. Each of these 3 columns represent that 79%. But it's important to look at, again, by sport and which of those categories they fall into. Swimming and diving at 78% is a high percentage that begins at the youth level. 69% of baseball, again, a very high percentage. When you look at percentages of sports that are probably 50 to 40% or below, that means they were actually spread out across those different categories. Again, we're only seeing 3 of the categories here. The other categories were the intramural level, intercollegiate level, professional or Olympic level. Those types of areas were also the categories, but they were just, the percentages were so low, we didn't want to clutter the screen with those. But again, it's important for us to know what the entry point of officiating is for the different sports within the Midwest, to help us perhaps with recruiting efforts, not just into the avocation of officiating, but perhaps even to target those areas, to look at recruiting them into Division III at the appropriate time. Go ahead, Sandy. Thank you. This next slide has a lot of information on it, and it's actually one of my favorite slides because it tells a lot of the story of the current pool of officials currently officiating Division III sports. The number on the right, in the far right column, is actually the average number of years it takes for an official to enter the avocation of officiating to get to the NCAA level, which quite often is the Division III level. The average, as Sandy mentioned earlier, is 8 years for all Division III sports, but we know when we delve deeper and look at the sports in particular, some are going to be above that average and some are going to be below. And so you can see in the far right the sports that take far longer than the 8-year average. And that's important, again, as we look at retention and how satisfied with officials are in the progression and the advancement in their careers. The other thing to look at is the numbers in those first 2 columns, the mean years at any level. So again, those beginning years at the youth level or the high school level, and then the mean years at the NCAA level. And that's how we obviously got to the average number of years to reach NCAA. But the higher numbers are you'll notice there's higher numbers in sports where perhaps, and again, this is not to slight any particular sport, but maybe where the physical demands are not as great, they can last longer, their tenure is longer than in sports. As you see toward the bottom, the fewer years or the lower numbers have more physical demands of the sport, so that perhaps they can't officiate quite as long. So those numbers are a little tighter. The average number of years to reach the NCAA level are going to be a little bit fewer. But we, again, as we look at our numbers and our pipeline and advancement, 14 years might be too long on average to wait for a softball umpire to be able to get into the Division III or in the NCAA ranks at all. So that's an important statistic, and we're going to look at that a little further as we look at the strategic plan. This next slide, again, is about other contests that Midwest Division III officials are working, and at least some contests at these different levels. High school for all 6 of the different regions was the highest number. It's for the Midwest, it's 77%. But you'll also see the junior college and NADIIAA being the next greatest influences and, quite frankly, competition for our Division III officials, because they're working these other contests. So it could have to do with the time commitment or the travel commitment, could have to do with the fee that's involved in these other levels. But again, strategic planning wise, we want to take a little bit deeper dive into where our Midwest officials, Division III officials are also working to see if we're losing officials because of again, fees involved, travel involved, whatever it might be within the region itself. Interestingly, the West region did not have high school. It was the only region that didn't have high school as the highest percentage in this grouping. It had junior college as opposed to the high school. So that, but all the other 5 regions had high school as the highest percentage in officials working at least some of the other contests.
Did you want to mention the Olympic?
Oh yeah, sorry. The professional and Olympic number is at 13%. certainly we don't believe our Division III officials are working professional basketball or professional soccer, but it's the Olympic involvement, and because of the NGB structures in sports like volleyball and soccer and field hockey, where they're likely working those in youth levels as well, but they identified it as Olympic. Okay. The next slide here is about compensation and satisfaction with compensation. All officials were asked about how satisfied were they with the compensation they were receiving for their contest fees. MidWest was actually the highest at 45%. Now you can see there's a fairly tight margin here between the top and the bottom of 45 to down to 33%. But what's interesting here is, again, the average is at just almost 41%. So MidWest is at the top, which is really great news in terms of satisfaction with compensation. However, we kind of have to look at the flip side of this number. So 45% are satisfied, which means 55% are not satisfied. So 1 and 2, you know, is not satisfied with compensation. But as we're gonna delve deeper into the conversation about compensation, we know that that is not the be all and end all of this research. It's not just about putting more money at contest fees, but it is important to understand where they fall in terms of their satisfaction. Before you move on, Sandy, interestingly enough, again, in the Midwest, the sports with the highest percent satisfaction, and you'll get this in the slide deck when we send this to you, swimming and diving at 83%, women's ice hockey at 71%, track and field at 67%, women's volleyball at 56%. The lower end on the Midwest region for basically not being satisfied, men's ice hockey at 23%, football at 32%, men's basketball at 35%, and baseball at 37%. So that just gives you an idea of kind of both ends of that coin of satisfaction in terms of sports specific feedback. Okay. The next slide is about assigning processes for the coordinators and assigners within the Midwest region. Again, we asked the officials to tell us to what degree do they agree with the statement that the process used by their coordinators and assigners to make assignments was fair. So again, the Midwest had the highest percentage of 70, Mid-Atlantic at 62 with an average of just under 66%. Which again is great, but again, we also have to look at the flip side of that. So if the average in D3 is just about 66%, that means 1 out of 3 officials doesn't think the process is fair. And so again, important to delve a little deeper into the sport to find out perhaps where we might be having problems within those regions. Midwest, the sports that specifically said that they thought the assigning process was fair: women's ice hockey, track and field, women's volleyball, baseball, softball. On the lower end of that was swimming and diving at 43%, women's soccer at 50%, men's soccer at 57%, wrestling at 68%. So again, interesting to see, again, both genders of sport on one end of that spectrum or the other, and women's soccer was on the lower end of that satisfaction level. The next one is about education and training. Also, again, influences retention levels for officials. The question was asked of officials: how effective is the education and training available to you as a collegiate official, and in this case, Division III official? So again, you see the Division III average of just over 71% believe it is effective. 77 was the highest in New England. Midwest was just below the average at 71%. But again, overall, very, very close to the overall average. So the Midwest officials, and again, this number was higher on average than the assigning piece. So the education and training available to them, they felt was pretty effective. Most cited the NCAA's resources as well as their own coordinators and assigners as the influencers on the education and training. Again, the sports specific in this area, women's ice hockey was near the top, women's basketball near the top, wrestling, women's volleyball, men's basketball near the top. On the lower end of that spectrum was men's soccer, track and field, swimming and diving, and women's soccer. So again, we're seeing a trend, a bit of a trend with men's and women's soccer on the lower end of these retention categories. And then the next one, which I find fascinating, because most officials, they want to work more contests, their assignments are very important to them, but also getting feedback and getting better in their avocation is important to officials. So you'll see pretty tight numbers here overall within each region. So the question was asked, how frequently do you receive feedback from your coordinators and your assigners about your contest performance? And so really just generally looking at this, it's about 50-50. The Midwest was just over that average of 51% receiving either frequent or occasional feedback versus hardly ever or never receiving feedback at 49%. This one is important for a lot of reasons. Again, retention is directly affected by the feedback they receive. Officials also understand that coaches are going to be involved in the evaluation process, which is essential to the process, but they also believe that neutral feedback, either from their coordinators and assigners or from neutral observers, is also important in the process. The sports that were receiving the most feedback from their coordinators and assigners, women's ice hockey, football, women's basketball, men's lacrosse, and then on the bottom of the sports, team sports, were men's soccer, softball, women's soccer. And interestingly enough, we delved a little deeper into the male-female piece of this, but women were actually 16% more likely to have selected the hardly ever or never receiving feedback from their coordinators or assigners than their male counterparts. So that's, again, something that we thought was interesting in the data, and certainly something we want to take a look at by region, by sport, and perhaps make recommendations in the strategic plan. Back to you, Sandy.
Thank you, Mary. We're going to take you through just 3 quick slides to take a peek at sportsmanship. There were many questions asked in and around sportsmanship to get a good sense of what the culture and climate is for officials and how they see it and how they would recommend improvement. We're going to just take you through some very general slides right now. This was the most general that asked the question for them just to describe sportsmanship and the treatment of officials during contests. And you can see that the excellent and good, this is the greatest category certainly, but there's 26% are less than good. So about 74%. And I want you to know that the Midwest region is the highest, and the span across the regions was 66% in the Mid-Atlantic to 74% in the Midwest. Sportsmanship is significantly better at the collegiate level than it is at the high school and youth level, according to the surveys available, the data available. However, we have work to do to ensure that this is not that we mitigate the retention factor here. We also asked to give you a perspective of the climate of officials. We asked about their experience, or had they witnessed sexist or racist behavior or language directed towards officials who are women or people of color. In the Midwest, 79% of officials said they had never experienced this, while 22% were not never, so had hardly ever or more frequently observed or had been a target of that behavior. It's important to know that women and people of color were significantly more likely to answer that they had occasionally or frequently witnessed or experienced this behavior themselves. The last slide to share with you is we asked the question about officials. Do you feel physically and emotionally safe from the time you arrive to the time you depart your competition venue? And you can see that 92% in the Midwest said that they did feel safe. Again, in all 3 of these categories, both the safety, the sexist and racist behavior, and the general sportsmanship, the Midwest fared the best in terms of the overall statistics. But there are still 9%, just under 10%, that did not agree that they felt safe. Interestingly, we did ask officials for what are the issues or experiences that are most important to your experience. What is the treatment, items provided, etc., that are most important to your experience when at a contest? And then we ask them a second question: how likely are you to receive these same items? And interestingly, the most disparate of what the officials were looking for and what they did not receive was somebody to escort them to and from the competition site. So interesting data that gives us a lot of information relative to what the experience is and how to work on improving it. So with that, I'm going to take you to a quick summary of the overarching conclusions and the recommendations. Hopefully you've had a chance to peruse the synopsis report of the report itself, but this will take you into a summary of that. The overarching conclusions were really 5 major conclusions. One is officiating exists in a complex environment. Officials work across divisions. They work inside the NCAA, outside the NCAA. They report to perhaps more than one coordinator. With regard to the authority and responsibility, everybody on your campuses, in your conferences, you have both the authority and responsibility for officiating. From an NCAA perspective, they have the responsibility, but no real authority over officiating. So it's an interesting dichotomy in terms of how the environment actually works and who can influence the environment. Number 2 is the impact of aging on the pipeline and the lack of availability of officials. Lots of data, just some small pieces of it we shared with you today. But lots of data that told us much about what the pipeline looks like, what's affecting it, and then what's happening with the quality of officials. Number 3 is with regard to coordination and communication around really important issues relative to retention, recruiting, evaluation, education. There are very few sports and very few regions where there is centralized either interdivisional or interconference coordination around those issues. Number 4 is there's a real need to address the culture and environment of officiating. And 5thly, a national approach focused on the systemic and cultural change is a must. It's an absolute if you're going to impact the trajectory of collegiate officiating. Bottom line, we found that if you want to pay officials more and recruit more, that is not going to be the investment that's going to answer the whole question for you. So with regard to recommendations, then, as a result of this data, we're going to show you the high-level recommendations in 3 categories. Number 1 is organizational leadership and oversight for officiating. Fundamentally, there needs to be some type of centralized oversight, accountability, as well as registration for officiating. We had over 10,000 officials in this survey, which is fabulous. We have no idea if 10,000 is 1% or 90% of our officiating. We know it's not close to 100%, but we have no idea. There's no central registration with the exception of one sport for officiating. Secondly, the important role that officials play in the student-athlete experience. This must be a center point of changing the future for collegiate officiating. It is not a necessary evil. It is a fundamental part of the student-athlete competitive experience and needs to be honored, respected in that way. And thirdly, it's a must that we diversify the pool of officials, not just diversify, but also create an inclusive environment. The second category is strategic alliances, and it's important that these strategic alliances are not just interdivisional within the NCAA, although it must start there. This has to be more broad. You saw Mary shared a slide that told you all of the places that officials are officiating. We know that they start someplace other than the NCAA. And so without some type of alliance and strategic alliance with all the other partners in this officiating process, we're not likely to change the future of officiating. Coaches associations, critical component. Coaches identify themselves, officials identify themselves as a critical component of the environment that officiating exists in. And so partnering with coaches associations is a must. And lastly, the strategic alliances include officials associations as well as NGBs. Lastly, the third category has to do with conference engagement. And this is getting down to the nitty-gritty of evaluation, education, and training, what needs to happen at that level, best practices, etc. Really taking a deeper dive on officiating fees and structures. This was a data point that was very difficult to get our arms around, and we have to look more closely at that. Certainly education, expectations, accountability for coordinators and assigners, a true must at the Division III level in particular, but all across the divisions as well. And then lastly, as we've mentioned before, the sporting behavior. So now what's next? What are we doing now? We're already well into the officiating strategic planning process, as Carolyn identified earlier. We have a working group, we have 7 commissioners that are representing you regionally on a working group that are meeting regularly with us. We're well into this. We have a draft of the strategic plan already circulating through stakeholder groups. What we're doing today is teeing you up to join us on December 15th, where we're going to get a very close to final draft of a strategic plan in front of you all to give us feedback. So please plan on joining us on December 15th from 1 to 2, I believe that's Eastern time. So where are we in the process right now? We initiated strategic planning in August. As I mentioned, we're deep into the stakeholder engagement now. Our seminar is going to be in December. We hope you join us there. And then we intend to have a draft, a final report in front of the Division III Commissioners Association by about the first week or so of February. So with that, I am going to take a breath and ask for any questions.
If you could, just raise your hand with the Zoom feature there, or put it in chat. We will call on people and you can unmute yourselves and we can have a dialogue.
I'll take that off of share screen so we can see one another, but if you would like for us to return to a slide, we're happy to do that.
Quiet group, Sandy.
We just blew you guys away. That's awesome.
I've got a couple comments. I thought the information was great. How you dug down into it. And the first few slides, first of all, I'm from Minnesota with the MIAC and the UMAC conference. But the problem that I'm seeing is that the younger officials that are working in high school that are applying to work at the Division III level want to know what crew they're going to be on in football and how many games they're going to get. They don't realize that takes time to get into college football, especially Division III. And your slide where it said it takes 8 years, to me, is excellent. The other thing that I find with the younger officials is that when they go from high school to college, Division III, they're looking at paying $125 to join the CFO, plus they're paying for a whole new uniform to referee football. And when they're only getting paid $185 a game, it takes them 2 or 3 games to recoup what they're actually making on the field for their time. So I think this is fabulous. You got great information, and I think you've hit a lot of things right on the head. So thank you.
Tom, thank you for your feedback. So you hit the nail on the head on really key issues, right? The pathway helping people understand the pathway, and it's a dance, right? There's, we certainly want to fast track competitive, prepared, skilled officials, yet they have to get the right amount of experience. We don't want to lose people in the process. So it's about helping people understand the pathway and then also mitigating barriers to the easy transition into the pathway of NCAA officiating. So you nailed it. And I think you'll see some of that in the strategies that are being developed.
Other questions, comments?
So Patrick, maybe while people are thinking, I was going to put Dan on the spot as somebody who's been involved with this as the original officiating committee and now with the steering committee to do the strategic planning. Dan, from your perspective, is there anything that jumped out at you that might be unique to the region, to your membership or membership across the Midwest?
Great question. I think I was happy to see about the satisfactory of salary. I mean, I think that's one of the things that we really do try to pride ourselves is offering a fair game fee. And I think we can always improve, but we also have to understand our D3 budgets. And I think for most people, I think they know that we are trying to be fair. We're trying to offer them what is a fair game fee. But I think as Tom Peralt brought up, there is so much more that goes into officiating, such as, you know, the CFOs or purchasing a new uniform or the travel piece of it. And so we have to be really conscious of that. And I think that's something that we have to be on in order to attract new officials. Because I always question who wants to jump into that role, who wants to be an official. Do we treat them right? Do we make it an attractive situation? And I think that's going to be our challenge is how do we make sure that pipeline is full when we are needing more officials. And I think that's kind of what stood out to me.
Thank you.
Anybody else?
So when we are going to share this slide deck with you, and when you receive a copy of it, you'll see that the data we shared with you regionally is also broken down by region and by sport. So you'll get to take a little bit closer look at what's happening by sport within your region. So we'll provide that as well. Bill, did you have a question?
Yeah, I guess I'm from the Great Lakes region. I'm the coordinator of umpires for MIAA, and I know Penny's on this call as well. So I guess my question is, and this is just for softball because I'm the coordinator of softball umpires, is like in my region, many umpires have worked travel ball, weekends, get to high school, and have umpired for 15 or 20 years, and then all of a sudden decide they want to become a collegiate umpire. So the one number that was alarming to me, and I think softball in your region was the highest, about how many years it took for them to get into the college ranks, but they didn't start off wanting to be in the college ranks. So the number is pretty high because they've umpired so many years at different levels, like travel ball all summer long and high school. And then all of a sudden at the age of 45, they decide they want to become a collegiate umpire. So they go ahead and they take this survey and they say, well, it's taken me 20 some years to get into the collegiate ranks, but really that was your first year of trying. Does that make any sense?
Mm-hmm.
What I'm saying?
Sure.
So that number could be really skewed is one thing. The other thing from, excuse me, from my region, and I'm texting Penny this right now, so I might as well just say it. Like, sometimes I think, especially, and I think the football guy from Minnesota covered it, is a lot of the younger officials want to jump fast. They don't want to buy their time. And then there's some umpires, and this is just my perspective, that want something for nothing. And what I mean by that is they don't go to camps to get better. They don't join the NCAA and get on our central hub to understand the rules differences, the mechanics differences. And part of that is going to camps to get better and to get feedback to get better. They just want to jump in and they don't know the rule differences or the mechanics differences, which a lot of them do travel ball. So they're using most of the time ASA mechanics or federation mechanics, which are the same, and collegiate umpire mechanics are different, as are the rules. So they just want to jump in and not get the training that they need or the rules knowledge that they need to get better at the collegiate level. And that's just my opinion. And sorry, I jumped in from the Great Lakes region, but I just think you needed to know that information, because I think it's not just here. I think it's nationally. And I was in Texas a couple weeks ago for a camp, and I see it down there as well.
Yeah, Bill, hitting on another great issue. You all know this space really well, and that is this whole concept of pathway. That one of the #1 strategies that we're recommending in this process is that we actually, by sport, start to articulate the pathway, right? Start to understand the process so people can kind of, one, know what they're getting into, two, understand how to navigate their way through it, you know, and know that it's a journey, right? So it's this is interesting space to be kind of walking through. And as we get to the place where we can show you all more of the goals and strategies, we'll be very interested to know, because you've got the boots on the ground, can these things happen, right? And how can they happen? And this is a 5-year plan, because there's no way you can eat this elephant one bite in one bite. So, you know, we'll very likely be focusing on the big issues like this, with regards, starting with the sports that are in the most crisis.
And Sandy, I would add to that, the critical piece to their bill is about the strategic alliances. So we can identify pathways and advancement strategies for NCAA officials, but if we don't communicate with the high school federation or the youth level, or even some communities, and we're all working together, then you know, that high school official that you mentioned that is happy as a clam for 20 years at work in high school, and then all of a sudden decides they want to change and do something different and get into the collegiate ranks. We're going to identify, hopefully intentionally identify those folks earlier, and work with those communities and those develop those alliances so that we can know those pathways. They know what their options are at the beginning, and you know, whether they choose to go down that path or not, they just at least have a better awareness of what options are available to them. Nobody at the high school level wants their best and brightest plucked off by the NCAA, and Division III doesn't want their best and brightest plucked off by Division I. But everybody wins when we work together and we strategize together. So that's really what we're trying to we're trying to develop, is those alliances, and so that everybody wins.
And Sandy,
Can I?
Sorry, Sandy, if you would, I would ask that you talk a little bit about some of the partnerships that we're trying to go through. In the chat, you'll see Davis Whitfield is chiming in that he'll share the high school officials. He's from the National Federation of High Schools, and he's joining us. But one of the things I wanted to comment before I turn back to you, Sandy, is back to Bill and Tom's points. One of the challenges, though, with the data that we have, is that the average age of officials is where it is, and the average age, or how many years to retirement of many of our officials, is also very close. So we have to, whether it's through collaboration, pathways, whatever it is, there needs to be some analysis of getting officials quicker to NCAA. And I don't mean the unprepared officials. We need the prepared officials, right? Trained, well-trained, everything that you're talking about. But if we're going to lose 50% of our officials in 6 years based on retirement, we're in a tough space, you know, if it's 8 years to get from start to NCAA. And so that's part of the reason the data is supporting, if we're looking at the data and we're trying to figure out the best way to grow pools of officials and to address, to Dan's point, the travel part, the cost of it. If we have more officials in more areas, travel will be less for our officials. And then the collaboration things that we can do can reduce the cost to become an official as well. So those are all really good points. But Sandy, if you could talk a little bit more about some of the partnerships that we're trying to establish. And again, welcome Davis for joining us on the call as well.
Yeah, the National Federation of High Schools has been extraordinarily open. They're working very, very hard at improving officiating, recruiting, improving the quality of officiating. And we're actually meeting with them later this week across their sections across the nation. Have met with Davis and with their executive director and others. And that's just one of the many strategic alliances, but probably the most important one to really get right and get well. And as you can see, Davis is sharing in the chat his openness to getting everybody connected, sharing officials, improving the quality of officials. And it's that attitude, if we can help change the culture so that it's more of an abundance than a scarcity attitude, then we can maybe get into where we can do some improvement. I know Matt Tiano has had his hand up here, and I wanted to make sure we get to his question or comment.
Sure, appreciate it. Matt Tiano, Upper Midwest, represent several conferences from a soccer perspective. So I agree with Bill and Tom in principle, but I think it's also important not to have too much of a barrier to entry. I think there are younger officials that are out there that feel as though that the same people that have always been assigned to games, or, you know, that the assigner basically runs things to, you know, make sure that their friends are covered. I think that's a big threat to the industry. And I think we have to be open to new people. I think we have to be open to younger people, you know, those people that are eager to learn and improve as well. So I personally think 8 years is too long, because they might hear or get to year 6 and say, you know what, I'm going to do something else in my free time. So I think it's a balance. While I agree with Bill and Tom in principle, I think we have to be open to getting newer, younger people involved, you know, at a quicker pace.
Matt, excellent.
Thanks, Matt.
Excellent feedback. It is certainly a dance. It's an art, not a science, to getting this balance right, because, you know, one of the target areas certainly is collegiate student athletes. Well, these young collegiate student athletes here, we want you to mess around in this for about 8 years, and then you can get into the NCAA. It'll be like, thanks very much, but probably no thanks, right? So what are ways that you know, prepared, ready, skilled people can start to learn and be educated, be prepared. They need to understand the strike zone. They need to be able to call the right call. They need to be able to do those things. It's not about hurrying people in. But that's where, again, these strategic alliances, as Davis has put in there, you know, creating a stock of new officials. The more we collaborate, the more likely it is that we can get skilled, quality, ready people to be prepared, to be shared, to be able to meet what they desire to do, and bring them along. So this is why we have continued to press that this data shared with us. This is a cultural systemic issue, and it's got to come from a strategic alliance standpoint, or the future will not change. And I want to add, we have found we have not received one roadblock of all of the people that we've reached out to receive feedback, to have collaborative conversations, to talk about collaborative assigning, to just get crazy and talk about whatever. There's not been one door closed to us, not one. So people see this as an issue, and thus far, people want to collaborate to solve it.
Sandy, maybe just to add to that, and in response to Patrick's question, some of the outreach that we are doing currently and will continue to do over the next month is outreach to national coordinators, national and Division III coordinators of officials from the NCAA standpoint. We will be having calls with conference coordinators, assigners from around the country. Sandy mentioned the National Federation and calls with their regional people who are experts in this area at the high school level. And then of course with the Coaches Association, because we understand, we know firmly that coaches play a significant role, certainly in the culture, but also in understanding how the partnership needs to work to ensure quality officiating. We get good people into the game and we keep them into the game as officials. And so I probably missed a few, but at least those are some of the high level groups that we're talking with, and we'll continue to engage in the strategic planning process, as well as coming back to all of you.
A little bit from the NCAA perspective, we are trying to continue conversations with divisions 2 and 1 in terms of engaging them to be a part of some of the strategies and conversations as we move it forward. We did have a national steering committee that had division 1, 2, and 3 representatives when the project of the analysis data collection project was going on. And we're trying to keep that moving forward. And the hopes are to, obviously try to put through similar programs across all divisions and throughout the country as well. Anybody else? Again, you will be getting the slide deck. It'll be emailed to you. So, and then contact information to the Pictor group will be there. We want information. We need information. So perspectives, thoughts, please send it to us as we put this together. This is truly a Division 3 effort coordinated by the Pictor group. So it is essential that we know and we hear voices across the region, across the country. Some of the strategies will be regional specific, so it'll help us collect that data as well. But if you didn't get to ask a question this time, please send it over to us. And then really would like to see some of your faces on the December 15th call. And that's going to be a lot more of engagement where we're going to ask you how you're going to respond to what we've put together, and we'll need your feedback there too.